He walked into that building every morning with a thermos of gas station coffee and a quiet nod to the security guard. Nobody learned his last name. Nobody asked. But when armed mercenaries seized the executive floor and a CEO pressed her lips close to his ear and whispered, "They took the hostages," the man everyone had overlooked for 3 years became the only thing standing between 47 lives and a body count. What happened next inside the Sterling Technologies Tower will stay with you long after this story ends. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where ordinary people hide extraordinary secrets, and we drop new stories every week that you will not find anywhere else. Smash the like button if you love cinematic storytelling, and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one starts the moment the elevator doors open and everything goes wrong. The thermos was the first thing people noticed about Ethan Cole, and usually the last. It was dented along the bottom left seam, not badly, just enough to catch the light in a certain way when he set it on the security desk during the morning bag check. The guard at the Sterling Advanced Technologies lobby, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who had worked the morning shift for 11 years, had stopped asking about it after the first week. He'd just wave Ethan through with a nod that barely qualified as acknowledgement, and Ethan would nod back in the same half measure, and that was the full extent of their relationship for going on 3 years. That was more or less how Ethan Cole existed inside Sterling Advanced Technologies. Not invisible, exactly. More like furniture. Present, functional, unremarkable. He drove the internal supply shuttle between the company's 2 buildings, handled light equipment maintenance on the lower floors, and occasionally helped the facilities team with whatever overflow work landed in their laps. He wore gray work pants and a company-issued jacket with a small patch on the breast pocket that read his first name in block letters. He kept his dark hair short. Not stylish short, just practical. And he had the kind of face that was difficult to describe after the fact. Not handsome, not plain, just a face that moved through the world without friction. He was 37 years old, and he had worked very hard to become forgettable. At 6:45 each morning, he parked his truck in the lower level of the employee structure, walked the half-block passage to the main building's service entrance, and signed in with a worn pen he kept clipped to his jacket pocket. He ate lunch alone in the supply break room on the 3rd floor, usually something he'd packed at home, something simple, whatever his daughter hadn't already raided from the refrigerator the night before. He left at 5:15 without exception, regardless of what was happening around him, because Lily had a strict pickup time at her after-school program, and he had never once been late. Lily was 8 years old. She had her mother's eyes and Ethan's stubbornness, which he considered an unfair combination for everyone involved. She liked graphic novels about space, had recently developed strong opinions about the correct way to make scrambled eggs, and she trusted her father with the uncomplicated completeness that only children are capable of. For Ethan, that trust was the only thing in the world he was still working to deserve. His coworkers knew a few basic facts about him. Single dad. Quiet. Didn't drink. Didn't complain. Didn't get involved in the small-scale dramas that rippled through any large building staff. Marcus, one of the other maintenance drivers, had tried to draw him out a few times over the years. He'd given up somewhere around the 18-month mark and landed on a comfortable theory that Ethan was simply shy. It was a reasonable conclusion. It was also completely wrong. The morning everything changed began like every other morning. Ethan signed in at the service entrance at 6:47 and took the freight elevator to the supply bay on the 2nd floor. He had a full shuttle run scheduled, a delivery of hardware components to the tech labs on 7, a document transfer to legal on 9, and a maintenance call from the facilities manager about a faulty HVAC panel on the executive level, which was 12. He loaded the cart, checked the manifest, and began his first run without hurry. He noticed the first thing on his 3rd pass through the lobby. 2 men in contractor uniforms were working near the building's secondary security panel, the one tucked behind the reception desk on the east side of the main hall. Ethan had been in this building long enough to know the contractor schedule. The building used a rotating roster of licensed technicians from 3 different service companies, and Tuesday morning was not a scheduled maintenance window for any of them. He paused at the cart long enough to watch the 2 men for roughly 4 seconds. They moved with a kind of deliberate casualness that was slightly off, the body language of people performing ordinary behavior rather than people who simply were ordinary. He noted it and kept moving. The second thing he noticed was the cameras. Sterling Advanced Technologies had a comprehensive internal surveillance network. 62 cameras distributed across the 12 floors, plus the parking structure and exterior. Ethan had spent enough time around the building's infrastructure to know where the cameras sat and roughly what they covered. On his second trip up to the 7th floor, he registered that 2 of the 3 cameras covering the northeast stairwell had been repositioned, barely, maybe 15 degrees, but enough that their effective coverage field had shifted away from the stairwell doors. Not broken, not offline, just pointed somewhere slightly less useful. Someone had done that on purpose. He noted it and kept moving. The third thing was the guards. Sterling had its own security team, 8 people on the day shift led by a former police sergeant named Harlow, who ran a professional operation. Ethan knew all 8 of them by sight. On his pass through the 11th floor hallway at 8:20, he counted 3 security personnel he did not recognize. They were wearing the right uniforms, the right colors, the right badge format. But the fit was wrong on one of them, and the way another was positioned near the executive floor stairwell door was not how Harlow's people positioned. Harlow's team stood with their backs to the wall when stationed. This man had his back to the hallway. Small things. Easy things to miss if you weren't paying attention in a particular way. Ethan had spent a long time trying not to pay attention in that particular way. He had put considerable effort into dismantling the habit, but the habit had never entirely left. He made his delivery to the tech lab on 7 without incident. He called the elevator and stood in it alone on the way back down, and he pressed his thumb against the dent in his thermos the way he sometimes did when he was thinking. His jaw was tight. He relaxed it deliberately. "You're a maintenance driver," he told himself. "Deliver the cart. Go home. Pick up Lily." He almost believed it. Victoria Sterling had not slept well. This was not unusual. She hadn't slept well with any consistency since she was 26, when she'd taken on her first major corporate role and discovered that her brain refused to stop running diagnostics at 2 in the morning. But the night before the Alvarado deal signing had been particularly bad. She'd been awake until 3:30 with the acquisition documents spread across her kitchen table, working through the same 4 clauses she'd already reviewed 14 times, looking for the thing she'd missed. She hadn't found it. That bothered her more than if she had. At 30 years old, Victoria Sterling was the youngest CEO in the company's 40-year history, a fact that the press reminded her of constantly in a tone that managed to be simultaneously admiring and skeptical. She had taken over Sterling Advanced Technologies from a board that had been openly doubtful of her readiness, and she had spent the last 3 years converting that doubt into a specific kind of institutional respect, the kind that doesn't require people to like you, only to take you seriously. She'd gotten there. She knew she'd gotten there because the people who had been most vocal about their doubts had quietly stopped talking. She had built this, brick by brick, deal by deal, with the specific focused energy of someone who has something to prove and knows exactly how to go about proving it. The Alvarado Technology Agreement, a joint development partnership with 3 international firms that would formalize Sterling's position at the center of next-generation medical data processing, was not just another deal. It was the capstone. It was the thing that would make the last 3 years mean something beyond survival. She needed it to go right. She rode the private elevator to the 12th floor at 8:55 and reviewed her notes one last time in the hallway outside the executive conference room. Her assistant, Derek, walked alongside her, running through the morning sequence with the efficiency of someone who understood that Victoria processed information better in motion than at rest. "Representatives from Alvarado and Reinhold are in the secondary conference room," Derek said. "Voss's team called. They're in the lobby. Should be up in about 10 minutes. Catering is set." Harlow cleared the floor at 8:30. "Harlow personally?" Victoria asked. "He signed off on the walkthrough, yes." She nodded. Her operations director, Raymond Solis, was already inside the main conference room when she entered. A composed man in his mid-50s who had worked at Sterling for 9 years and who Victoria trusted with a directness she didn't extend to many people. He was reviewing the term sheet binders and looked up when she came in. "How are we sitting?" she asked. "Ready," he said. "Clean room. I checked the server access protocols this morning. Everything's locked down on our end." "Good." She put her notes on the table and poured herself a glass of water from the credenza. "Let's get this done." Ethan was on his way to the 12th floor at 9:15 when the elevator stopped unexpectedly at 10. The doors opened and one of the unrecognized security guards stepped in, the one whose uniform didn't fit right. Up close, the man was wider through the shoulders than the uniform could properly accommodate, and there was a rigidity in how he held himself that had nothing to do with professional posture training. He glanced at Ethan's cart and then at Ethan's badge and then away, which was the standard behavior of someone who wanted to appear unbothered. "Maintenance?" the man said. "HVAC panel on 12, Ethan said. "Work order from this morning." The man said nothing else. He rode to 11 and stepped off without looking back. Ethan let the elevator doors close. His heart rate was at 64 beats per minute. He knew this not because he was monitoring it, but because he had spent enough years in situations that required monitoring it. That he had developed an awareness of its baseline, the way some people develop an awareness of the weather. 64 was calm. 64 was a man delivering maintenance supplies. His hands were completely still. He pressed 12. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides and a long oval table that seated 20. The representatives from Alvarado and Reinhold were already seated when the 6 men who had identified themselves as the advance team for Voss Consolidated entered at 9:22. The guns came out 11 seconds later. Victoria's memory of the first 30 seconds was always going to be fragmented. The crack of the conference room door hitting the wall, the sound of someone's chair scraping hard against the floor, a sharp command in a voice that carried the specific flat authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in chaotic environments. She registered the weapons before she registered the faces. Compact tactical firearms, held with a practiced ease that told her immediately these were not security contractors playing a role. These men knew exactly what they were doing. The one in front, tall, angular face, a thin scar running from his left ear to the edge of his jaw, spoke with the controlled volume of someone who didn't need to shout to communicate what would happen if he was ignored. Nobody moves. Nobody reaches for anything. The first person who does something stupid becomes an example for the rest of you. Victoria's instinct was to stand up. She suppressed it. She pressed both palms flat against the table and breathed through her nose and looked at the man directly, which was apparently not the response he was accustomed to because something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "Ms. Sterling," he said, "sit down." She hadn't moved. "I'm sitting." "Then stay that way. Bucket." Ethan heard the sound from the freight corridor on 12, a short, sharp sound that most people would have processed as something mundane. A door, maybe. Something dropped. Ethan stopped his cart. He stood completely still in the corridor for 3 full seconds. Then he moved to the corridor's side access door and pushed it open a half-inch, and looked through the gap. He counted 4 of them in his immediate sightline, all armed, all positioned with the deliberate geometry of a trained unit, not a panicked one, which was significantly worse, because panicked people made mistakes and trained people made decisions. Through the glass partition of the executive conference room, he could see the hostages, 15 people seated or kneeling, the representatives from 3 companies, Victoria Sterling's assistant, a woman from the legal team whose name he didn't know, and Victoria herself, sitting very straight with her hands visible and her face doing something complicated. He let the door ease back to nearly closed. For a long moment he stood in the freight corridor with his hand still on the doorframe, and he thought about Lily's pickup time, and he thought about the scrambled eggs argument they'd had Sunday morning, and he thought about a lot of things very quickly and with great clarity. Then he stopped thinking about them. He moved back down the freight corridor to the supply closet he had passed 40 seconds earlier. The closet held cleaning equipment, spare parts for several of the floor's utility systems, and a wall-mounted communications terminal that the cleaning crew used to log their rounds. He checked the terminal. The floor's main communication systems were down. Whatever these men had done, they'd disrupted the standard lines. He pulled out his personal phone. No signal. The building's cellular coverage was being actively jammed, which meant they had hardware they hadn't walked through the lobby with, which meant they'd had access to this building before today. His mind filed that away. He needed to understand the full picture before he moved. How many men, how many floors they controlled, what their objective was, whether they had a countdown or a trigger. Moving without that information was how people died. He had learned that the hard way in environments that made this corporate tower look like a waiting room, and the lesson had cost him things he was still not prepared to think about clearly. He slipped out of the supply closet, and moved toward the stairwell. In the conference room, the man with the scar had introduced himself to no one in particular. He wasn't interested in introductions. He had his team moving with the efficiency of a plan that had been drilled into muscle memory. Two men with the hostages, two working on the executive floor's server access terminal in the adjoining room, one at the stairwell door, and the leader himself circulating through the space with the patient attention of someone checking inventory. Victoria watched him. She was good at reading people. It was arguably the skill that had gotten her further than any other in her career. And what she read in this man was not recklessness. He was not improvising. He had a specific thing he wanted from this building, and hostages were not the goal, but the containment strategy. They were insurance, which meant whoever was funding this operation wanted the information more than the violence, and violence would only be employed if the information was threatened. That told her something. She wasn't sure yet what to do with it. She became aware that someone had moved into the peripheral space near the conference room's side wall. Not one of the armed men. They were accounted for. One of the building's maintenance workers, a man she had passed enough times in hallways to faintly recognize but whose name she had never once registered. He was crouching behind the low partition near the server room doorway. He looked calm. That was what struck her first. Not frightened, not frozen, but calm in a way that was different from the numbness she saw on the faces of the other hostages. His eyes were moving across the room in a slow, systematic pattern, and something about the pattern itself, the deliberate order of it, made her pulse change. He caught her looking at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with the smallest possible gesture, just his chin, just a fraction, he indicated the armed man nearest to her, and then the door. And then he looked at her with a question in his eyes that she understood without any translation. How many? She had counted 6. She raised her hand beneath the table and extended 4 fingers, then a thumb, then the index finger of her other hand. He processed this without visible reaction, then looked back at the room. He had a small cut on his forearm that he hadn't had before, she noticed. Fresh. He'd already been somewhere she hadn't seen. She leaned barely an inch in his direction and said, so low it barely qualified as sound, "They took the hostages. There are people on the floor we can't see." Something happened in his face when she said that. Not alarm. Something older than alarm. Something she didn't have a word for yet. "I know," he said. It was the first time she had ever heard his voice. He was already scanning the room again by the time she processed those 2 words. His eyes landed on the server room door, then the stairwell access, then the scar-faced man's position, and the way he looked at all of it, with that patient, measuring attention, told Victoria Sterling something that rearranged everything she thought she understood about this morning. The quiet maintenance worker was already solving this problem. He had been solving it before she whispered a word. She watched him shift his weight almost imperceptibly and understood that he was about to move, and that wherever he was about to move, he had already calculated the margin for error and decided it was acceptable. She didn't know his name, she didn't know what he was, but she had spent 3 years learning to recognize competence in people. And what she saw in the stillness of this man was not maintenance work. It was something she had never encountered in a corporate tower before. Something that, in this moment, with guns pointed at everyone she was responsible for, she needed more than anything she had ever needed from a board member, a lawyer, or an investor. The man in the gray work jacket with the dented thermos clipped to his cart in the hallway moved into the shadow of the doorway and disappeared. Ethan Cole had not wanted to become this person again, but he was already gone. The stairwell smelled like concrete dust and recycled air, the same as every stairwell in every large building Ethan had ever moved through, and that familiarity was almost grounding. Almost. He took the stairs down 1 floor with his back against the wall and his hand trailing the railing without gripping it, because gripping things made noise, and noise was a decision you couldn't take back. At 11, he eased the stairwell door open 2 inches and held it there. 2 men, positioned at opposite ends of the corridor in a coverage pattern that told him they had done this before. One near the elevator bank, one near the emergency exit on the north end, both carrying the same compact weapons he'd seen through the conference room partition. The elevator side man had a radio clipped to his vest that was dark. Not in use, which meant they were operating on a closed frequency or hand signals, which meant they were disciplined, which was the thing Ethan had most been hoping not to confirm. He let the door ease back and stood in the stairwell with both hands loose at his sides. Okay, so this was real. He hadn't fully allowed himself to accept it until this moment, or maybe he had accepted it the second he heard that sound on 12 and felt something in his chest shift into a gear he'd spent years grinding down to nothing. Either way, it was accepted now. He ran the numbers the way he used to run them, the way that had kept him alive in places where the math had to be right the first time. 6 confirmed on 12, minimum 2 on 11, unknown presence on other floors, communication jamming active, exits compromised. They had planned this with access to building schematics. The repositioned cameras, the non-scheduled contractors, the guards in the wrong uniforms. All of it was pre-positioned. This operation had been assembled over days, maybe weeks, with inside information from someone who knew how this building worked from the inside out. That last part he set aside for now. It was important, but it wasn't the immediate problem. The immediate problem was 47 people. He'd done a fast count through the conference room partition, distributed across 2 floors with no working communications, no security presence that hadn't already been neutralized, and a team of professionals who had come here for something specific and were fully prepared to hurt people to get it. Ethan had no weapon. He had gray work pants, a company jacket, a dented thermos on a supply cart parked 2 floors up, and approximately 2 decades of training that had been dormant for 3 years. He thought about Lily for exactly 4 seconds. He let himself think about her fully. The scrambled eggs argument, the way she fell asleep in the car when he drove her home from her grandmother's, the graphic novel she'd left open on the kitchen table last night with a sticky note on the page she was on because she didn't believe in dog-earing. He thought about all of it, and then he put it away in the place where he kept things that mattered too much to carry while working. Then he went back to thinking about the man at the elevator bank. The man's name, as Ethan would learn much later, was Pryor. He was 31 years old, ex-military, privately contracted for the last 4 years. And he was good at his job, in the way that men who are trained well and paid well and given clear parameters tend to be good at their jobs. What he was not good at, what almost no one was good at, was accounting for a threat that moved like it belonged there. Ethan had learned a long time ago that confidence was the most effective camouflage available. Not aggressive confidence, not the kind that announced itself. The quiet, purposeful kind that made the brain file what it was seeing under familiar rather than threat. He walked out of the stairwell door on 11 with the unhurried posture of a maintenance worker handling a facilities call. His eyes on the floor, a utility wrench in his right hand that he'd taken from the supply kit on his cart before coming down. The wrench was not a weapon. It was a prop. A man with a wrench looked like a man doing a job. He was 8 feet from Pryor before the man registered him. "Hey," Pryor started. Ethan was already inside his reach. What happened next took 4 seconds and made very little sound, which was the only metric that mattered. He used the wrench once, not to strike, but to redirect, and the rest was leverage and positioning and the kind of mechanical efficiency that looks almost gentle to anyone watching and is anything but. Pryor went down controlled. Ethan caught his weight and lowered him to the floor rather than letting him fall, because a falling body makes noise and noise was still a decision. He dragged the man into the nearest office doorway, a darkened conference room whose door he'd confirmed was unlocked on his earlier pass, and he relieved Pryor of his radio, his sidearm, and the access card clipped to his vest. He checked the radio. Closed frequency, as expected. He kept it off, but slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he checked the sidearm, a compact 9mm standard configuration, 1 round already chambered. He held it for a moment and felt the familiar weight of it, and felt something else alongside the familiarity that he didn't particularly want to examine. He safety-checked it, confirmed the magazine, and put it at the small of his back. He had a weapon now. The math changed. He moved toward the north end of the floor before the second guard reached the conference room on his patrol rotation. Victoria had been watching the door since the maintenance worker disappeared through it. She knew she shouldn't be watching the door. Watching the door drew attention to the door, and attention to the door was a problem she wasn't equipped to solve right now. She redirected her gaze to the table in front of her and focused on keeping her breathing even and her hands still, which was harder than it should have been because she was, underneath all of the composure she'd spent years cultivating, frightened in a way that was physical. A low-grade trembling in her chest that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the fact that there was a weapon 6 feet from her face and the man holding it had already demonstrated in the first 30 seconds that he was comfortable holding it. His name was Cross. She'd heard one of the others use it, Damien Cross. He moved through the conference room like a man conducting an inspection. Not aggressive, not performing for the hostages, simply present in the way that authority makes itself present. He had the kind of self-possession that Victoria recognized from a certain type of executive, the ones who had never learned to doubt themselves, except that in those men it tended toward arrogance, and in Cross it was something colder and more considered. He didn't need anyone in this room to be afraid of him. He simply needed them to be still. Victoria's assistant, Derek, was seated 2 chairs down and was doing an admirable job of not falling apart, which she noted with something that might have been affection under different circumstances. Across the table, the Alvarado representative, an older man named Ferreira, who had flown in from his company's offices and who had been in the middle of a pleasantry about the coffee when the guns came out, had his eyes fixed on the table surface with the focused concentration of a man trying to survive by simply refusing to acknowledge what was happening to him. She understood the instinct even while she didn't share it. Next to Cross, Raymond Solis sat with his hands folded on the table. Victoria had looked at him twice since the takeover began, both times with the specific purpose of making eye contact and establishing some shared understanding of their situation. Both times, Raymond had looked somewhere else. She had initially attributed this to shock. Raymond was measured by nature, not physically brave, and she'd never had reason to evaluate him in a crisis. But by the second look, she felt something shift in her reading of it. Raymond was not looking away because he was frightened. He was looking away because he couldn't hold her gaze. She filed that information somewhere careful and did not let it change her face. Cross stopped near the server room doorway and spoke to the man working the access terminal, a compact, precise man who hadn't given his name to anyone and clearly didn't intend to. "How long?" Cross said. 12 minutes for the full extraction. Maybe 10 if the encryption level is what Solis said it was. Cross glanced at his watch. "You have 8. Make it work." The man at the terminal said nothing and went back to what he was doing. Victoria processed that exchange with the part of her brain that was still running calculations underneath the fear. Solis. The man at the terminal had said Solis, which meant Raymond had provided specifications, which meant the encryption level of her company's secure servers was known to the people currently holding guns to her employees' heads. She looked at Raymond again. This time he was already looking at her. And in his expression, beneath the careful composure, beneath 9 years of professional familiarity, she saw something that she had no word for in this moment except sorry. Her stomach dropped. She looked away before Cross could read the exchange. Ethan found the 3rd and 4th men on 10. They had established a communications relay point in the facilities manager's office. Equipment she didn't recognize, a compact jamming array, and what looked like a mobile command unit feeding information to someone outside the building. The window of the office was partially open and he could see the parking structure across the way, and on the 3rd level of that structure, angled toward the tower, there was a dark SUV that had not been there at 7 this morning when he'd parked his truck in the lower level. He couldn't see inside the SUV from this angle, but the SUV being there told him there was a command presence outside coordinating with the men inside, which complicated the math again in a direction he didn't love. He backed away from the window. 2 men in the office, both facing the equipment array, backs to the door. The office had a secondary entrance through the adjacent break room that most people didn't know about because it was usually blocked by a supply shelf, but Ethan had moved that shelf himself during a facilities restructure 8 months ago and knew the door behind it was accessible. He went through the break room. He was not going to be able to do this silently twice. One of the 2 men heard him coming through the break room door and turned, and for a half-second they looked at each other. The man processing what he was seeing, Ethan already committed to what he was doing. And then the half-second was over, and it was 30 seconds of controlled chaos that left Ethan with a bruised rib on his left side where he'd caught a hard elbow, a split on his lower lip that was going to taste like copper for the rest of the day, and 2 men zip-tied with their own equipment cable on the floor of the facilities office. He'd used the plastic cable ties from the equipment array because they were what was available, and he was reasonably confident they'd hold for at least an hour. He sat on the edge of the desk for a moment and breathed. His ribs hurt. He was 37 years old and hadn't done anything like this in 3 years, and it turned out that 3 years was enough time for your body to start registering complaints that it wouldn't have bothered with at 28. He pressed his palm against his left side, confirmed nothing was broken. Bruised was manageable, broken was a problem, and stood back up. He checked the communications array. He didn't have the technical background to reverse whatever jamming protocol they'd implemented, but he could disable the array entirely, which would disrupt their coordination with the SUV outside. He pulled the power unit and removed two components he identified as critical to the signal relay and pocketed one of them, then dropped the other behind the break room refrigerator. The jamming was still active, that was coming from a separate unit somewhere, but their external coordination was now compromised. Small wins, stacked carefully. He looked at himself in the break room's small wall-mounted mirror. The split lip was bleeding slowly. He pressed the back of his hand against it, held it for a count of 10, took the paper towels from the dispenser and pressed them against it for another 10, and then left them in the trash and moved toward the door. He needed to get back to 12. The hostages had been in the conference room for 40 minutes when Cross's patience visibly shifted. It was subtle. Victoria might have missed it if she hadn't been watching him as carefully as she had, with the sustained focus of someone who understood that the most useful thing she could do right now was understand this man's decision-making process. He checked his watch twice in the span of 5 minutes, which he hadn't done in the previous 35. He moved to the server room doorway again and said something low to the technician, and the technician's response was too quiet to hear, but the set of Cross's jaw afterward told her it wasn't what he wanted. Something was going slower than planned. She didn't know if that was good. She caught Derek's eye briefly. He was holding together by the thinnest thread. She could see it in the too careful stillness he was maintaining, the way people get very controlled when they're actually very close to not being controlled. And she gave him the smallest nod she could manage, which meant nothing specific and meant everything it needed to mean, which was, I see you and I need you to keep holding. He exhaled slowly and looked at the table. Good. Raymond had not moved since the exchange of looks between them. His hands were still folded on the table with a stillness that no longer read as calm, and now read as a man trying very hard not to draw attention to himself, which was the opposite of what his demeanor had been for every year she'd known him. Raymond Solis was not a man who avoided drawing attention. He ran meetings. He chaired operational reviews. He had a particular habit of leaning forward when he spoke, like the physical proximity would make the words land harder. He was now someone she did not recognize. Cross moved to the north end of the room and spoke briefly with the armed man stationed near the window wall. Victoria could not hear the exchange, but she watched Cross's face during it, and a decision happened in his expression, a small compression of something. And then he turned back toward the room, and his eyes landed on her. Ms. Sterling, he said, I need you to stand up. She felt every person in the room stop breathing. Why? She said. It came out flat, which was not how she intended it. She intended it as professional, a tone she knew how to use, the one that acknowledged authority without surrendering ground. But flat was what came out, maybe because some part of her had gotten past the point where she could modulate for impression. Cross looked at her for a moment. He wasn't annoyed. He was evaluating. Because I'm going to need your cooperation on something, he said. And I'd rather you stand when we have this conversation. She stood. Her legs were steady, which surprised her slightly. Your server access requires a senior executive biometric, Cross said. Specifically yours. The password protocols my team can work around. The biometric requires your presence. And if I decline? He tilted his head a degree. Then this takes longer and becomes more unpleasant for the people sitting in this room. That's not a threat. That's a factual description of the situation. Victoria looked at the people sitting in this room. Ferreira, who had nothing to do with any of this. Derek, who had come to work this morning because she needed him here for a document signing. A woman from legal named Andrea, whose 3-year-old daughter she knew about because Andrea had brought her daughter to the holiday party, and the little girl had spent 45 minutes convinced the decorative plant in the lobby was a jungle. She looked at Raymond Solis and let him see her looking. His eyes went to the table. All right, she said to Cross. What do you need? Well, Ethan came back through the 12th floor service entrance at a point when he'd confirmed no armed presence in the immediate corridor, which had taken him longer than he wanted, because the patrol rotation was more disciplined than he'd hoped, and he'd had to wait in a supply closet on the north end for 4 minutes, while a man with an automatic weapon walked past 3 feet from the door. 4 minutes was 4 minutes. He didn't lose his mind over it. He stood in the dark among the cleaning supplies and the extra HVAC filters and breathed evenly and waited. When he got back to the freight corridor and worked his way toward the conference room, the layout had changed. Victoria Sterling was no longer at the table. He identified her through the glass partition, standing near the server room door, cross beside her, the technician at the access terminal now directing her attention to a biometric panel that had been activated from within the room. She was complying. She had the careful body language of someone buying time rather than surrendering. Slight delays between instructions, a question here, a request for clarification there, which told him she was smart in exactly the way he'd needed her to be smart. 2 armed men inside the conference room with the remaining hostages. Cross and 1 other in the server room. Biometric authentication in process. He figured the extraction of whatever they were after was now between 6 and 10 minutes from completion. After completion, the hostages became a liability rather than an asset. Men like Cross did not leave rooms full of witnesses behind them on a job like this. He needed to move in the next 4 minutes. He also needed something that currently didn't exist, which was a way into the conference room that didn't end with 2 armed men having enough time to react before every person sitting at that table became a target. He pressed his back against the corridor wall and thought. The ceiling. He looked up. This floor had a suspended tile ceiling, the standard corporate configuration, with a maintenance access panel at the far end of the freight corridor that opened into the crawl space above the conference room and server room complex. He had gone into that crawl space 14 months ago to help run a cable conduit for the IT team, and he remembered its layout well enough to know there was a ceiling vent panel that sat directly above the server room and another above the room's interior hallway. He would not fit through the vent panel above the server room. It was too narrow. But the hallway panel was different. The hallway panel was a full access hatch. He looked at the cut on his forearm and the split on his lip and the bruise forming on his left side that he was trying not to feel. He thought about the man he used to be, the one who had done things in crawl spaces and freight corridors and dark stairwells and called it necessary, called it service, built an entire identity around the capacity for it, and then lost 2 men on a bridge in a coastal city whose name he still couldn't say out loud without something going wrong in his chest. He thought about how he'd walked away from that and told himself it was permanent. He thought about Victoria Sterling buying time at a biometric panel with a gun 3 feet from her. He thought about 47 people. Then he found the ceiling panel at the end of the freight corridor and pushed it open and pulled himself up into the dark. In the conference room, the man stationed near the window wall, whose name was Briggs, and who had been doing this work for 6 years, and who was privately of the opinion that this particular job had been mismanaged from the planning stage because using a corporate building's internal layout required a level of inside coordination that created exposure, but whose opinion had not been requested, heard something above the ceiling. It was faint. It could have been the building settling. It could have been the HVAC system. He looked up at the suspended tile panels above him and registered nothing unusual. He looked back down. He did not look up again. This was the mistake that would define the next 90 seconds of the morning. In the server room, Victoria had reached the 4th of what the technician needed to be 7 authentication steps, and was in the process of misremembering her secondary passphrase for the 2nd time. Genuinely misremembering, not fabricating. Her memory for passphrases when her heart rate was elevated was not reliable, a fact she found infuriating, when she heard a sound from the hallway outside the conference room. Not loud, not alarming. The specific kind of sound that the brain almost doesn't register. Almost. Cross heard it too. He looked toward the conference room and then back at her. Something had happened. She could see him calculating it. "Stay here," he told the technician. To the man beside him, "Check the hall." The man moved toward the conference room. He got as far as the doorway. What happened after that, Victoria did not fully see. She heard it. A compressed sequence of sounds that lasted about 4 seconds, then a heavier sound, then nothing. Then one of the conference room's armed men appeared in the server room doorway with his weapon up, and behind him, very close, was the maintenance worker. Ethan Cole had his forearm across the man's throat, and the man's weapon arm controlled at the wrist, and he looked directly at Cross over the man's shoulder with an expression that was not threatening and was not uncertain and was neither of the things Victoria might have expected. It was just a face doing a job. "Let her go," Ethan said, "and we talk about how the rest of this morning goes." Cross looked at him. His weapon was at his side but not raised, and in the 2 seconds of silence that followed, something passed between the two men, a kind of recognition that Victoria couldn't read and didn't have context for. And then Cross said quietly, "I know who you are." Ethan said nothing. "You've been out 3 years," Cross said. "You're a maintenance driver. You have a kid." A pause. "You don't want this." "No," Ethan agreed. "I don't." He adjusted his grip on the man in front of him. "But here we are," he said. Cross did not raise his weapon. That was the thing Ethan watched most carefully in those first seconds. Not the man's face, not his posture, but his weapon hand, because the weapon hand told you what the decision was before the face caught up to it. Cross kept the firearm at his side with a looseness that was either confidence or calculation. And with a man like this, Ethan suspected it was both. "You've been carrying that guilt for 4 years, Cross said. His voice had the same controlled flatness as before, but something had shifted in it. Not warmth, nothing close to warmth, but a kind of deliberate precision, like a man who understood he was in a negotiation and was choosing his words accordingly. "Yusuf and Garrett, the bridge? You froze and they died, and you walked away from everything because of it." The name Yusuf landed somewhere in Ethan's chest that he didn't have time to feel. He filed it. "I didn't walk away because of guilt," Ethan said. "I walked away because I was done." And yet, Ethan agreed. The man he was holding had stopped struggling. That was professional discipline. He'd recognized that the hold was secured and that fighting it was burning energy he might need later. Ethan respected the professionalism even while it complicated things, because a man conserving energy was a man waiting for an opening. Victoria had not moved from the position she'd been in when Cross told her to stay. She was standing near the biometric panel with both hands visible and her eyes moving between Ethan and Cross with the focused attention of someone who was processing everything and had the discipline not to let the processing show on her face. Ethan had noted her in his peripheral awareness since the moment he'd come through the ceiling access. She was not panicking. She was not checked out. She was present in a way that was useful, and he needed her to stay that way. "Here's what I know about you," Cross said, with the conversational ease of a man discussing something neither of them was particularly emotional about. "Cole, Ethan James, 37. SEAL Team 6, 8 years of service, decorated twice. The second time posthumously for the people under you who didn't come home. You got out 18 months after the bridge. You have a daughter named Lily. You drive a truck and fix HVAC panels, and you haven't thrown a punch in 3 years. He tilted his head. "That last part was until today." "Why are you telling me things I already know?" "Because I want you to understand that I'm not underestimating you. I never underestimated you, even when we were on the same side." A pause that had weight in it. "I want you to understand that there are 11 people in my operation, and you've accounted for 4 of them. And you're good, Cole. You are genuinely good. But the math stops working for you somewhere around the 5th one. And when it stops working for everyone in that conference room." Ethan said nothing. He was listening, but he was also counting. 11 total, 4 down, 7 remaining, including Cross himself, the technician, and the man currently in Ethan's grip. 4 more unaccounted for in the building. "Let my man go," Cross said, "and I give you my word that everyone in that conference room walks out of this building when we're done." "Your word," Ethan said. "My operational record. Check it." Cross's jaw tightened slightly. 14 engagements, 0 civilian casualties. I am a professional, not a butcher. We take the data, we leave. That's the job. "And the explosives?" Something happened in Cross's face. It was small. A compression around the eyes, not quite surprise but adjacent to it. And it told Ethan 2 things simultaneously, that the explosives were real, and that Cross had not expected him to know about them. "Insurance," Cross said, after a half-second. "Standard protocol for a clean extraction. They don't get used if the extraction goes clean. And if it doesn't go clean?" Cross looked at him steadily. "That depends a great deal on what you do in the next 30 seconds. Victoria spoke. "There are 18 employees on the lower floors," she said. Her voice was level. "Floors 3 through 6. People who came in this morning and have no idea what's happening up here. If your insurance goes off, you're not talking about a clean extraction." Cross shifted his gaze to her. He studied her with the same evaluating attention he'd given Ethan, and for a moment the room was very quiet. I'm aware of the building occupancy, Ms. Sterling, he said. Then you're aware that your word, as you call it, is contingent on a clean extraction, and a clean extraction is contingent on factors you may not control. She held his gaze. So let's talk about what makes it cleaner. Cross looked back at Ethan. Something moved behind his eyes that Ethan couldn't fully read. Not respect, not quite, but something in the neighborhood of recognition. She's something, Cross said. She's right, Ethan said. The standoff held for 3 more seconds. Then Ethan made a decision and released the man he was holding. Not because he believed Cross, not entirely, but because the negotiation had an architecture and fighting, it made everything harder. The man stepped forward and Cross put a hand on his arm briefly, which was the gesture of a man calling off a response, and the response was called off. Ethan kept the sidearm at the small of his back and his hands where Cross could see them. You have a problem, Ethan said. Your extraction is behind schedule, your relay team on 10 is offline, and whatever the people in that SUV in the parking structure are telling you, they're working with incomplete information. The police scanner that building security had on the security desk went to emergency broadcast 15 minutes ago. Someone on a lower floor found a hard line. He watched Cross's expression. You have maybe 20 minutes before this building has company. That was partially true and partially a construction. The emergency broadcast was real. He'd heard it faintly through the facility's office window before he'd gone up through the ceiling. Whether someone had actually reached a hard line or whether the scanner had triggered automatically, he didn't know. But the pressure was real either way, and Cross needed to feel it. Cross was quiet for 4 seconds. Finish the extraction, he said to the technician. He said it without urgency, which told Ethan more than urgency would have. Then he looked at Ethan. Don't do anything I'd do, he said. It wasn't a joke. It was information. Ethan received it as such. The next 8 minutes were the kind of 8 minutes that don't announce themselves as critical until they're already over. Ethan moved back into the conference room under a truce that nobody had formally articulated and nobody fully trusted, which was the only kind of truce available in this situation. The 5 remaining hostages at the table registered his return with the specific relief of people who had been holding their breath and were not yet sure they could stop. Ferreira had his eyes up now. Derek was sitting forward with his elbows on the table, the posture of a man who had quietly decided to stop pretending he wasn't terrified and had arrived somewhere past the pretense at something more functional. Andrea from legal had her hands in her lap and her jaw set, and she met Ethan's eyes when he came in and gave him a look that asked a question he answered with a slight shake of his head that meant not yet. She understood it. She looked back at the table. The armed man Cross had called off. He hadn't given a name, none of them had given names, resumed his position near the door with the mechanical adjustment of a man resetting to his assigned task. He was watching Ethan, not aggressively, just with the sustained attention of someone whose professional assessment of the room had recently been revised. Ethan sat 2 chairs down from Derek and put his hands on the table. Raymond Solis was sitting at the far end of the table and had not moved, had not spoken, had not looked at anyone since the moment Cross had the technician confirm the server encryption specifications using Raymond's name. He was holding the stillness of a man in a room where the walls were closing and who had run out of directions to turn. Ethan looked at him. Raymond did not look back. Ethan leaned slightly toward Derek without turning his head. Is there a way off this floor that doesn't go through the main stairwells or the elevators? He said, low. Derek blinked. The southwest corner, there's a secondary egress stairwell behind the executive washrooms. I don't think they know about it. It's not on the main building schematic. Why not? It was added during the last renovation, and the documentation never got updated in the central system. I only know because I helped coordinate the renovation scheduling. Ethan absorbed this. A stairwell off the main schematic meant off whatever building plan Cross's inside source had provided, which meant it was a route they hadn't accounted for. How many people can move through it at once? 2, maybe 3. It's narrow. Ethan nodded once and went quiet. He looked at the server room door. The sounds of the technician working had changed in character. Less typing, more a single sustained tone that suggested a data transfer in progress rather than an access negotiation. They were through the authentication protocols. The data was moving. He had less time than he'd told Cross. He looked at the window wall. The man Cross called Briggs was still there, and Briggs had his eyes on Ethan with a watchfulness that had tightened since Ethan came back into the room. He'd been evaluated and upgraded in Briggs's internal classification, which was correct but inconvenient. Ethan thought about the southwest stairwell. He thought about 5 people who needed to move through a narrow egress 2 at a time, and a server room where the data extraction was 90% complete, and a man named Cross who had given his operational word and meant it up until the moment he didn't. He thought about the explosives. He did not know where the explosives were. That was the variable that made everything else contingent. A detonation without knowing the device location was a risk he couldn't calculate, and a risk he couldn't calculate was a risk he couldn't accept with other people's lives as the unit of measurement. He needed to find them. He needed to move the hostages first. He needed to keep Cross occupied in the server room long enough to do both. He looked at Raymond Solis. Raymond, who had provided the server encryption specifications. Raymond, who had provided the building layout, the security rotation, the camera positions. Raymond, who had been in this company for 9 years, and who had sat across from Victoria in 1,000 meetings, and who had handed all of it to the people now pointing guns at the people he'd worked beside. Ethan was not a man given to moral outrage. He'd seen too much of the world's actual mechanics to find betrayal surprising. But he was a man who understood leverage, and Raymond Solis, sitting at the end of that table with the particular stillness of someone drowning slowly, was leverage. He was also the only person in this room who knew exactly what Cross's team had come for and what they'd been told about the building's vulnerabilities, which meant he was also, possibly, the only person who knew where the insurance had been placed. Ethan looked at the armed man near the door, then at Briggs near the window wall, and then he did something that he was fairly certain neither of them would anticipate. He leaned forward, put both elbows on the table, and said, at normal conversational volume, "Mr. Solis." Raymond's eyes came up. Briggs moved his weight slightly, attention sharpening. "I need you to tell me something," Ethan said. He kept his voice even and gave it nothing to read. No accusation, no threat, just a man asking a direct question. "And I need you to tell me fast because the window is short and the answer matters." Raymond's jaw worked. His hands, still folded on the table, tightened slightly. "Whatever you think you know," Raymond started. "I know enough," Ethan said. "I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about the device locations. Where did they place them?" The room went very still. Briggs took a step forward. "Hey, he's not getting up," Ethan said to Briggs without looking at him. "We're having a conversation. You can listen." He looked back at Raymond. "Where?" Raymond Solis looked like a man who had reached the bottom of something and found it was not the bottom. "I didn't know about the explosives," Raymond said. It came out barely above a murmur. "I swear to you, I didn't know. They told me it was a data extraction. Clean, in and out. But you know where the team had access?" A pause that lasted too long. "The server room. The main electrical panel on 11, and the freight loading bay on 2. 3 locations. A standard infrastructure collapse pattern. Take out the server room to eliminate data recovery. Take out the main electrical to collapse building systems. Take out the loading bay to prevent emergency vehicle access from the east side." It was methodical and it was brutal, and it told Ethan something important. This was designed to look like a catastrophic equipment failure, not an attack. Whoever had commissioned this wanted the data gone and the trail clean, and a building fire caused by electrical failure covered both. "Thank you," Ethan said. Raymond made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Briggs was 3 steps closer than he'd been 30 seconds ago, and his hand was on his weapon, and the situation had moved to a threshold. Ethan stood up. "I'm going to the washroom," he said to Briggs, with the flat matter-of-factness of a man who has decided that the performance of normalcy is the only card left in the deck. "You can walk me there, or you can note that I went there. I don't particularly care which." Briggs looked at him. The calculation was visible. The weighing of whether stopping him was worth the disruption, whether Cross's implicit truce extended to bathroom supervision, whether this man who had come through the ceiling 20 minutes ago was actually going to the washroom. 3 minutes, Briggs said. 2 is fine, Ethan said. He walked to the door. He did not go to the washroom. He went to the executive washroom corridor, which was a narrow L-shaped hall that fed to both the men's and women's facilities, and which, behind the second door on the left, did not lead to a janitor's closet. as labeled, but to the southwest egress stairwell that had been added in the renovation and never properly documented. Derek had been exactly right about its width. It was a squeeze, barely enough for two people moving sideways, the kind of narrow utilitarian passage that buildings accumulate when they're built in stages by different architects who communicate imperfectly. It went all the way down. He confirmed this by looking over the railing into the descent. 12 floors of painted concrete and thin pipe railing, and a faint smell of fresh construction sealant. No evidence it had been used in months. No evidence it appeared on anyone's operational planning documents. He went back to the hallway. He had 90 seconds of Briggs's 2-minute window left. He used 40 of them to move to the supply closet at the end of the washroom corridor, where he'd seen, on his earlier pass through this floor during the normal course of his morning delivery, a fire suppression access panel. Behind the panel was a manual override for the floor's sprinkler heads, a system he was familiar with because he had helped recalibrate it during a maintenance update 6 months ago. The manual override allowed section-by-section activation independent of the main fire alarm system. He activated the section covering the server room. He was back through the washroom corridor and into the conference room with 11 seconds to spare on Briggs's window. The sprinklers in the server room came on 45 seconds later. The reaction was immediate. The technician shoved back from the terminal with a sound between a curse and a shout, his equipment already flashing damage alerts as the water hit the exposed hardware. Cross was in the doorway between the server room and the conference room when it happened, and Ethan watched him process it, the calculation moving across his face with the speed of a man who had contingency plans and was running through them. And then Cross was on his radio for the first time, which meant the closed frequency silence had broken, which meant he was pulling the string on the next phase. "We're moving," Ethan said. He was already standing. He looked at Derek first because Derek was the one who told him about the stairwell, and Derek was the one who needed to lead. "Southwest," he said. "The door behind the labeled janitor's closet. Take Ferreira and Andrea. Go now and go fast." Derek processed this in about 1 second and then stood up. "Come on," he said to Ferreira, and Ferreira moved with the urgent compliance of a man who has been waiting for any instruction that involved moving and now finally had one. Briggs registered the motion and took a step forward. The sprinklers in the server room were audible now, a steady hiss and drip that was soaking expensive equipment and the technician's considerable effort, and Cross stepped through the doorway into the conference room with an expression that had passed through calculation and arrived somewhere harder. "Cole," he said. "Your extraction is done," Ethan said. "Whatever the transfer completed before the water hit it is what you're leaving with. It's not complete, and it can't be recovered today." He kept his body between Cross and the door through which Derek, Ferreira, and Andrea were now moving. "You came here for data. You don't have all of it. You need to decide what the rest of this costs." Cross's eyes moved to the door, to Ethan, to the 2 remaining hostages, because Raymond had not moved and would not move, Ethan suspected, out of some compound of guilt and paralysis and the specific immobility of a man who could not figure out which side he was on anymore. "The devices," Cross said quietly. "You found out about the devices." "Locations," Ethan said. "Not confirmation of placement. Are they placed?" Cross was quiet. "Are they placed?" Ethan asked again, with no more force than the first time. "2 of 3, Cross said. "The loading bay on 2 was compromised. We skipped it." Which meant the server room and the electrical panel on 11. Which meant if the man with the radio and the detonator was outside in the SUV and received a termination signal from Cross's device. "Call it off," Ethan said. "The job isn't finished. The job is done. Call it off." Briggs had his weapon up. The remaining armed man was at the door. Victoria was still in the server room doorway and hadn't moved, and Ethan was aware of her in that peripheral way he'd been tracking her all morning, aware that she was present, that she was thinking, that she hadn't stopped thinking since the moment he'd first made eye contact with her through the conference room glass. What Victoria did next was not something Ethan would have predicted. She picked up the biometric panel that the technician had left on the server room workstation, a flat, sealed unit about the size of a hardcover book. And she walked into the conference room and set it on the table in front of Cross with a sound that was not quite a slam, but was in that direction. "The authentication didn't complete," she said. "You have partial data, maybe 40% of what you came for, depending on what transferred before the water. The rest is encrypted at a level that requires the panel to re-authenticate." She looked at Cross with the directness that Ethan was coming to understand was simply how she operated, not performance, just how her face worked when she was done pretending. You want the rest? You need this panel, and you need me. And neither of those things are leaving this building today. So either you detonate your devices and walk away with 40% and a body count that will bring more law enforcement attention than any data is worth, or you call it off, and your team exits before the police arrive, and you have a fraction of a job instead of a catastrophe. The room was quiet enough that Ethan could hear the water still running in the server room. Cross looked at the panel. He looked at Victoria. He looked at Ethan. You're both going to be a significant problem for whoever hired you, Cross said. And it was not a compliment and was not a compliment. Call it off, Ethan said, for the third time. Cross reached for his radio. The call took 12 words and a confirmation code that Ethan didn't hear clearly. What he heard clearly was the silence afterward. The absence of the sound that would have meant everything in the building below them had stopped being a building. That silence was the most useful thing he'd heard all morning, and he allowed himself exactly 3 seconds to register it before moving to the next problem. The next problem was that Cross had called it off, and Cross was still in the room with 2 armed men, and the truce had reached the natural limit of what a truce between people in this particular configuration could sustain. The stairwell you don't know about, Ethan said to Cross. Southwest, behind the janitor's closet label. It goes all the way to the ground floor. He watched Cross's face. Use it. Take your men. I don't know what law enforcement response looks like in the next 5 minutes, and I don't know what your plan is for that, but that stairwell is not covered, and the door at the bottom exits on the south side of the building, not the east. Cross studied him. Why? He said. It was a genuine question, not suspicious, just genuine. Ethan thought about it for a moment and gave the only honest answer available. Because I'm done counting bodies, he said. I'm done adding to the number, that's all. Something moved through Cross's expression that Ethan didn't try to name. Then Cross looked at Briggs and the other armed man and gave a short nod that contained a direction, and the 2 men moved. Cross paused at the conference room door. The bridge, he said, without turning around. Yusuf and Garrett, for what it's worth, and I know it's not worth what you think it should be, that call was the right call. The wrong outcome doesn't always mean the wrong call. Ethan said nothing. Cross left. The conference room was quiet for a moment that lasted about 4 seconds and felt much longer. Then Victoria exhaled through her nose and sat down in the nearest chair, not with collapse, but with the deliberate quality of a person choosing to put their weight down after holding it too long. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. Raymond Solis had not moved from his chair. Victoria looked at him now, and the look had nothing performative in it. No anger staged for effect, no coldness she'd assembled on the way up to this moment. It was just the face of a woman looking at a man she had trusted who had made her into someone's operational variable. 9 years, she said. Raymond's jaw worked. He looked at the table. Victoria, don't. She said it quietly. Not right now. He stopped. Ethan moved to the door and checked the corridor. Empty. He went to the end of the hall and confirmed the stairwell access. The southwest door was ajar, recently used. He went to the railing and listened. Footsteps, descending, fading, Cross's team moving fast and clean. He came back. The lower floors need to know it's over, he said. Do you have any way to reach the building PA from here? Victoria looked up. The facilities manager's office. There's a hardwired PA panel that's independent of the main system. 10, Ethan said. I cleared it earlier. I know where it is. Then let's move. She stood, and he noted that her legs were steady, which they had been steady since the first moment she'd stood up in this room at Cross's instruction, and he found himself thinking, briefly, without particular commentary attached, that she was the least fragile person he'd encountered in a very long time. They moved into the corridor together, and the building was quiet around them, and the sprinklers in the server room had soaked $3 million worth of equipment and an incomplete data extraction, and somewhere below them 3 people were already 11 floors down a forgotten stairwell that nobody had thought to document. Raymond Solis sat alone at the conference table. He was still sitting there when the police came through the main stairwell door 14 minutes later. He did not try to explain himself. There wasn't a version of it that would have helped. Ethan and Victoria were on 10 when they heard the first sirens outside the building, distant but closing, and neither of them said anything about it. They just kept moving through the corridor toward the facilities office, and the cut on Ethan's arm had started to hurt in a dull and real way that it hadn't while the adrenaline was still running, and he registered the pain with something close to relief, because pain that you can feel afterward is categorically different from the other kind. He pushed open the facilities office door. The PA panel was on the north wall, undamaged, exactly where he'd seen it on his earlier pass-through. He stepped back from it and looked at Victoria. "It's your building," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read, and then she walked to the panel and picked up the handset and pressed the broadcast key. Her voice, when it came out, was even. Clear. The voice of a woman who had sat in a room with guns pointed at her for the better part of 2 hours, and had emerged from it with her ability to communicate fully intact. "This is Victoria Sterling. The situation on the executive floor has been resolved. All personnel, please remain where you are. Law enforcement is entering the building now. You are safe. Please stay calm and wait for instructions." She held the broadcast key for another second after she finished. Then she set the handset down. Ethan leaned against the doorframe with his arm throbbing and his ribs saying things he was choosing not to acknowledge yet. And he thought about Derek and Ferreira and Andrea moving down a narrow stairwell. And he thought about the 47 people in this building who were going to walk out of it today, floors 3 through 6, where people had been sitting at their desks all morning with no idea what was happening. 12 floors above them. He thought about all of it, and then he thought about Lily. He reached for his phone. No signal, the jamming was still partially active, and then looked at the communications array that he'd disabled earlier in the day. He had one of the critical components in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, examined it, and considered the equipment array on the desk. He didn't have the technical background to restore the jamming system. He also didn't need to. He needed a phone signal for about 45 seconds. He looked at Victoria. "Is there anything in this office that's a direct cell booster, independent of the main system?" She looked around the room and then at the equipment shelf on the east wall. There, the gray unit. It's a backup cellular relay for the facilities team. Keeps them connected when the main system is overloaded. He found it. It was active, running on its own battery backup, completely separate from whatever Cross's team had deployed. He held his phone next to it. 1 bar, 2. He dialed. The phone rang once before a woman's voice came on. Familiar, slightly frazzled, the background noise of children and an after-school facility. "Meadowfield After School, this is Janelle." "Janelle, this is Ethan Cole, Lily's dad." His voice came out steadier than he'd expected. "I'm not going to make the pickup at 5:15. I need someone to stay with her until I call back." "I'm fine. Tell her I'm fine." A pause. "Of course, Mr. Cole. Is everything okay?" "Everything's okay," he said. "Just tell her I'll be there. Tell her not to worry. I'll let her know." He ended the call and put the phone in his pocket. Victoria was watching him from the other side of the room with an expression he still didn't have a clean read on, and he became briefly aware that he was a man with a split lip and a bruised rib and a cut on his forearm, standing in a damaged facilities office, telling an after-school coordinator that his daughter shouldn't worry, which was a particular kind of absurd that he didn't have the energy to process right now. "Lily," Victoria said. "That's her name." "Yeah." She nodded once, slowly, and looked toward the window where the sirens were now audible without ambiguity. Close, multiple, the overlapping frequencies of law enforcement and emergency response, converging on a building that had spent the last 2 hours containing something that most buildings never contain. "We should go meet them," she said. "Yeah," he said again. He straightened up off the doorframe. His ribs registered the movement with a pointed specificity that he chose to interpret as character building. He walked to the door and held it for her, not because she needed him to, but because it was the most ordinary thing he could think of to do. And ordinary felt important right now in a way he couldn't fully articulate. She walked through and he followed her into the corridor, and they moved toward the main stairwell together, and the building was quiet and the sirens were loud, and it was 11:47 in the morning on a Tuesday. And somewhere below them, the people who worked in this tower were sitting at their desks, waiting to find out that they were going to be all right. The first officers came through the main lobby at 11:52. Ethan knew this because he and Victoria were on the 4th floor landing of the main stairwell when they heard the ground level door open below them. The specific clatter of tactical entry, boots on concrete, the short compressed commands of people moving in a practiced formation through an unknown space. He stopped on the landing and put one hand briefly on the stairwell wall, not for balance, but as a signal, and Victoria stopped beside him without needing to be told why. "Law enforcement," he called down clearly, with his hands already raised to shoulder height. "Two civilians. We're coming down." A pause. Then, "Identify yourselves and descend slowly." They descended slowly. The officer who met them at the base of the stairwell was a woman in tactical gear with the specific coiled readiness of someone who had entered the building expecting the worst and was now in the process of reassessing. She looked at Ethan. The split lip, the cut forearm, the general condition of a man who had been in several places he wasn't supposed to be, and then at Victoria, and then back at Ethan. "Are you injured?" "Not seriously," Ethan said. "There are people in the southwest egress stairwell, secondary exit, not on the main schematic, opens on the south side of the building. 3 individuals who exited the executive floor approximately 40 minutes ago. They should be at the base or already out." The officer relayed this into her radio without taking her eyes off him. "The primary threat has exited the building," Ethan continued. "Southwest stairwell as well, approximately 20 minutes ago. 6 to 8 individuals, armed, likely moving on foot toward the south perimeter. There's a command vehicle, dark SUV, that was in the parking structure on the east side. It may have relocated." He paused. "There are 2 incendiary devices in the building, server room on 12 and the main electrical panel on 11. Both are disarmed. The operative who placed them was directed to stand down before exiting, but you'll want your EOD team to confirm." The officer stared at him for a moment. "How do you know all of this?" she said. Ethan lowered his hands. "I work here," he said. The next 3 hours were the kind of controlled chaos that large-scale law enforcement response generates in a building that has become, very suddenly, a crime scene. Ethan sat in a folding chair in the lobby. They'd converted the reception area into a staging point and answered questions from a rotating cast of people. First the responding officers, then a detective named Marsh who had the tired eyes of someone called off a different assignment, and the sharp attention of someone who understood that what he was being told was not the shape of thing he usually dealt with. Then 2 federal agents whose jurisdiction Ethan understood without needing it, explained because the involvement of a private military contractor in a corporate data theft crossed enough lines to bring in people with broader authority. He told them everything in the order it happened and left nothing out except the 4 seconds he'd spent thinking about Lily before he moved the first time, which was not relevant to their investigation and was the only piece of the morning that was entirely his. Victoria was in a separate staging area doing the same thing with a different set of people, and Ethan could see her across the lobby when the traffic between them cleared, sitting very straight in a chair that was not designed for comfort, answering questions with the focused efficiency of a woman who understood that clarity now would determine how the next several weeks of her professional life went. She had a paper cup of coffee that someone had brought her, and that she hadn't touched. Derek was 2 chairs down from her, wrapped in one of the emergency blankets the paramedics had distributed with the specific institutional generosity of people who know the blankets won't actually fix anything, but are required to offer them anyway. He wasn't hurt. I was holding the blanket around his shoulders anyway, and Ethan thought that was probably fine. Ferreira and Andrea had made it out through the south exit, as Derek had directed, and were already accounted for. Ferreira had apparently spent the last 40 minutes in a sustained phone conversation with his company's legal team that he'd conducted in a mix of English and Portuguese from the sidewalk outside, which Ethan found oddly reassuring. A man in that much distress with his legal team was a man who was going to be fine. The EOD team confirmed the devices on 12 and 11 at 12:34. Disarmed, as Cross had directed. The confirmation came through Marsh's radio while Marsh was sitting across from Ethan, and Marsh looked at his radio and then at Ethan with an expression that was doing several things at once. "Clean deactivation," Marsh said. "Both units." Ethan nodded. "You want to explain to me again why you let the primary operative walk out of the building?" "I pointed him to a stairwell," Ethan said. "I didn't escort him. That's a distinction that's going to matter to exactly nobody above my pay grade." "I understand that." Marsh looked at him steadily. He was somewhere in his late 40s, the kind of man who had made a career out of reading rooms and people and the space between what people said and what they meant. "The southwest stairwell," he said. You told him about it. Yes. Why? Ethan had given this the same answer he'd given Cross, because he was done adding to the body count. It was the true answer, which didn't make it a complete answer. The more complete answer was that Cross, whatever else he was, had honored the terms of their operational truce. He'd called off the devices. He'd moved his team without incident. He'd left the building without the data completing its transfer. In a situation with as many variables as this morning had contained, that outcome was not guaranteed and was not nothing. Ethan had made a judgment call about what the next 5 minutes were going to cost if he'd made a different choice, and he had made the call, and he would defend it clearly and without apology to whoever needed defending to. I assessed that forcing a confrontation with an armed team in a building with 47 civilians and 2 active incendiary devices was a worse outcome than creating an exit route, he said. The data extraction was incomplete. The hostages were unharmed. The devices were deactivated. That's the math I was working with. Marsh wrote something in his notebook. You're going to have to give that assessment to people with significantly more authority than me, Marsh said. I know, Ethan said. You doing okay with that? Ethan looked at him. It was an unexpectedly human question from a man who had been conducting a methodical professional interview, and it landed differently than the procedural questions had. Ask me again in a few days, Ethan said. Marsh almost smiled. Fair enough. Raymond Solis was arrested at 1:17 in the afternoon. Ethan wasn't present for it. He was in the middle of a second interview with the federal agents when it happened, but he heard about it from Marsh afterward. 2 officers had come to the conference room on 12 where Raymond had remained, apparently without moving, for the better part of 2 hours. According to one of the officers, Raymond had stood up when they came in, told them he wasn't going to make it difficult, and asked if he could make a phone call first. They said yes. He called his daughter in Portland. Whatever he said to her, it took 4 minutes, and by the end of it his voice had broken entirely, and he'd had to stand there holding the phone for another minute after the call ended before he was able to put it down and hold out his wrists. Ethan absorbed this information and said nothing about it to Marsh. He thought about it later, in the specific way that you think about things that don't resolve cleanly. The 9 years Raymond had worked alongside Victoria, the particular quality of the expression Raymond had been wearing in that conference room, the phone call to his daughter that took 4 minutes. He didn't arrive anywhere useful with it. Some things didn't resolve into a clean lesson, and he'd been alive long enough to know that forcing them to was worse than leaving them unresolved. He signed the initial statement at 2:45, was told he would need to be available for follow-up interviews over the coming days, and was released from the lobby staging area at 3:10 with a card from the federal agent, a card from Marsh, and a recommendation from the paramedic who had looked at his arm and ribs that he see a doctor within 24 hours. He told the paramedic he would. I was standing on the sidewalk outside the main building entrance, in the particular stunned quiet of someone who has been in controlled motion for 4 hours and has abruptly run out of immediate things to do, when Victoria Sterling came through the front door. She had changed. Someone had brought a bag from her office, her assistant Derek, probably, and she was wearing a clean blazer over what was clearly a different shirt than she'd started the day in, and someone had given her the opportunity to wash her face, and she looked like a person who had been through something significant and had made the decision that looking like a person who had been through something significant was not the public presentation she intended to lead with. She stopped a few feet from him on the sidewalk. They looked at each other for a moment with the particular quality of 2 people who have shared an experience that neither of them has the vocabulary for yet. They told me you've been cleared, she said. For now, he said. More questions coming. Same. She looked at the building behind him, or through it, more accurately, the way people look at things they're not really seeing. The FBI agent told me the data transfer captured about 38% of the server's classified assets before the sprinklers hit. Enough to be damaging, not enough to be catastrophic. What sector? Medical data processing architecture. The proprietary framework we've been developing for the Alvarado partnership. She paused. Someone paid for this specifically. Not a speculative theft. Targeted acquisition. You have competitors who'd want that framework. Several. Her jaw tightened slightly. Raymond would know which ones had the operational capacity and the willingness. He'll talk, Ethan said. Eventually. They always do when there's a deal to make. She looked at him. That doesn't bother you? The deal-making part? It bothers me, he said. It's also how most of these things get resolved. The part that bothers you and the part that's useful are frequently the same part. She absorbed this. A news van had pulled up across the street, the second one. The first had arrived while Ethan was still inside. A reporter was doing a stand-up with the building in the background, and the building looked exactly like itself, glass and steel and the ordinary geometry of corporate architecture, which seemed almost wrong given what it had contained this morning. "They're looking for the story," Victoria said, about the news van. "They'll get one," Ethan said. "Not the whole one, but enough." "Are you going to talk to them?" "No." She nodded as if she'd known this before asking. "Ethan," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name. She'd gotten it from someone. The officers, probably, or the FBI. It sat differently in the air than it did when people said it in the normal context of his life. "I need to ask you something." He waited. "The bridge," she said. "Cross mentioned it. You don't have to tell me, but I want to know if you want to tell me." He looked at the sidewalk for a moment. He had not talked about the bridge to anyone. Not his sister, not the two therapists the Navy had run him through in the 18 months before his discharge. Not the friends from his service years who had tried to stay in contact and whom he had let drift gradually into silence. He had not talked about it because talking about it required deciding what the story was, and he had never been able to decide what the story was. It was not a clean story. It did not have the narrative shape of either tragedy or lesson. It was just a bridge and two men and a decision that he'd made in the wrong direction, and then it was a grief so large and so specific that he'd had to dismantle most of his life to find somewhere to put it. "Another time," he said. "Okay," she said. No pressure in it, no performance of understanding, just okay, and she meant it. They stood on the sidewalk for another moment in the afternoon light, which was doing the thing it sometimes does in the middle of the day in late autumn, where it comes in at an angle that makes everything look more significant than it probably is. "I need to get my daughter," Ethan said. "Go," Victoria said. "I'll make sure your access badge is cleared for tomorrow if you want to come back. Or if you don't, I'll be there at 6:47, he said. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, not far from one. "Okay," she said again. He walked to the employee parking structure, found his truck on the lower level where he'd left it at 6:45 that morning, and sat in it for a minute before starting the engine. His ribs were making their position known with some insistence. The cut on his forearm had been properly cleaned and dressed by the paramedic and was behaving itself. His split lip had gone from bleeding to simply sore. The kind of sore that you notice every time your mouth does anything, which is more often than you'd think. He started the truck. He drove to Meadowfield after school, which was 4 miles from the Sterling Tower in a neighborhood that transitioned from commercial to residential in the way that cities transition, gradually and then suddenly, the glass and steel giving way to 3 flats and corner markets, and the particular density of places where people actually live. He was 40 minutes late. He signed in at the front desk, where Janelle, a round-faced woman in her 30s who had been working at Meadowfield for 6 years and who had developed the specific unflappable quality of someone who has managed other people's children through enough emergencies to know that emergencies resolve, looked at his face and did not ask. "She's in the reading room," Janelle said. He found Lily exactly where she always was when he was late, in the reading room's far corner, in the beanbag chair that she had claimed as personally hers by some unspoken consensus with the other kids, with her graphic novel open on her knees. She was on the page with the sticky note. She had not turned past it, which told him she'd been waiting with enough restlessness that she hadn't trusted herself to continue reading without him there. She looked up when he came through the door. She looked at his face, the lip, the arm, and she sat up in the beanbag chair and the graphic novel slid off her knees, and she didn't pick it up. "Dad?" "I'm fine," he said. He crossed to the corner and sat down on the floor next to the beanbag, which was something he did sometimes because the beanbag didn't accommodate 2 people and the floor next to it did. "I'm fine, Lily." She looked at his lip. "What happened?" "It was a hard day at work." This was technically accurate. She looked at him for a long time with the evaluating attention that 8-year-olds apply to their parents when they are trying to determine whether the version they're being given is the true version. Ethan met her gaze without looking away, because looking away was how you told an 8-year-old they were right to be skeptical. "You look like you got into a fight," she said. "I resolved a situation," he said. She considered this distinction. "That sounds like a fight with extra steps." He almost laughed, which his ribs immediately registered a protest against. He pressed his hand against his left side and breathed carefully. "Are your ribs hurt?" she said. "A little." "That's definitely a fight." "Lily, I'm just saying what I see." She picked up the graphic novel from the floor and closed it, which meant she was done reading for the day because she never closed a book she was planning to return to in the same sitting. "Are we getting food or are you cooking?" The normalcy of the question landed in his chest, somewhere unexpected. "What do you want?" he said. She thought about it. "Pho, from the place on Clement." "Okay. And I want to hear what happened." "Not today," she added, reading his face. "But at some point. You know I always find out anyway." "You're 8 years old." "I'm perceptive," she said, with the dignity of someone who has been told this enough times to have absorbed it as identity. He looked at her, the graphic novel tucked under her arm, the expression of someone who had spent an afternoon trying not to worry and had succeeded only moderately, the particular face that was her mother's eyes, and his stubbornness, and something entirely its own. And he felt the specific weight of the day settle fully for the first time since 9:22 that morning. "Come on," he said, and pushed himself up from the floor, which was harder than it should have been, and he hoped she didn't notice. She noticed. She handed him her backpack without comment so he wouldn't have to bend down to pick it up, which was the kind of consideration that 8-year-olds produce when they love someone, and it hit him somewhere in the vicinity of the breastbone with more force than any of the morning's physical events had managed. They walked out together into the afternoon. The days after were not simple. The federal investigation moved quickly by the standard of federal investigations, which meant slowly by the standard of normal human impatience. Ethan gave 3 additional interviews over 5 days, each longer than the last, each going deeper into the operational specifics of what he'd done inside the building and why. He answered every question directly and without elaboration beyond what was asked, and when asked why he'd made specific decisions, he gave specific answers. And when asked about his background, he gave the accurate version, without the parts that were classified and without apology for the parts that were. The question of whether he'd obstructed the apprehension of a suspected criminal by informing Damian Cross of an unlisted exit came up in the 3rd interview, asked by a federal attorney who had the particular quality of someone who had found a thread and intended to pull it, regardless of what unraveled. Ethan explained his reasoning in the same terms he'd used with Marsh: the assessment of cost, the outcome achieved, the judgment call made in real time with incomplete information in a building containing 47 people and 2 incendiary devices. The federal attorney wrote things down and asked follow-up questions that circled the same point from different angles, and Ethan answered each circuit with the same information, and eventually the circuit stopped. He was not charged with anything. He had not expected to be, but there was a difference between not expecting something and not having to wait for the confirmation. The investigation into Raymond Solis moved on a separate track that Ethan was not involved in except as a witness. What he knew from Marsh, who called him on the 4th day with a professional informality that suggested they were moving towards something closer to a working relationship than either of them had anticipated, was that Raymond had begun cooperating within 48 hours of his arrest. The company that had commissioned the extraction was a private data brokerage firm operating out of 3 jurisdictions, fronted by a venture capital entity that had been quietly acquiring medical technology, intellectual property, for 18 months. The Alvarado framework had been on their acquisition list for 14 months. They had identified Raymond Solis as a vulnerably compensated senior executive. His finances had been under pressure for 2 years following a costly legal dispute, and had approached him through intermediaries 6 months before the morning of the attack. Raymond had not known about the explosives. Ethan believed this. Not because Raymond had said it, but because of the expression on Raymond's face in the conference room when the word had entered the air. That was not the face of a man managing his reaction to expected information. That was the face of a man who had just understood that the thing he had convinced himself was a controlled situation had never been controlled at all. It didn't absolve anything. It didn't need to. It just made the picture more complete. The media coverage lasted 11 days at full intensity, and then began the standard migration to adjacent stories that all coverage undergoes eventually. Sterling Advanced Technologies issued a formal statement on day 2, authored by Victoria but carefully reviewed by legal, that confirmed the incident, confirmed the safety of all personnel, and gave no operational details. It mentioned enhanced security protocols, the company's cooperation with law enforcement, and the resilience of its workforce. It did not mention Ethan Cole by name. He had requested this. Victoria had honored it without argument, which he had appreciated. What the media did find eventually, on day 7, in a piece by an investigative journalist who had clearly spent significant effort talking to people in the building, was a reference to an unnamed Sterling employee who had been described by multiple eyewitnesses as having moved through the building during the crisis in a manner inconsistent with his job description. The piece was careful about what it claimed and what it implied, and the implication was enough to generate 3 days of follow-up coverage speculating about the identity of whoever had done what the eyewitnesses were describing. Ethan read one of these pieces on his phone during his lunch break on the 8th day, in the supply break room on the 3rd floor, eating the sandwich he'd packed at home. He read it once, put his phone in his pocket, and went back to his sandwich. Marcus came in while he was finishing it. "Crazy stuff, man," Marcus said, pouring himself coffee from the break room machine that produced something approximating coffee if you didn't look at it too closely. "You were in the building that day, right? When it all happened?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "You see anything?" Ethan looked at Marcus, with his easy manner and his comfortable theory that Ethan was simply a quiet and slightly shy man who drove a supply shuttle and kept to himself. "It was a confusing morning," Ethan said. "Yeah, I'll bet." Marcus shook his head. "Glad everybody's okay." "Yeah," Ethan said. "Me too." Marcus took his coffee and left, and Ethan sat in the break room for another few minutes, finishing his lunch in the specific quiet of a Tuesday afternoon in a building that was trying, with the particular institutional determination of large organizations, to return to normal. On the 11th day, Victoria came to the supply break room. This was not a thing that happened, ordinarily. The CEO of Sterling Advanced Technologies did not, in the ordinary course of events, appear in the supply break room on the 3rd floor at 12:15 on a Tuesday. Ethan looked up from his lunch, and she was in the doorway in a blazer and the expression of a woman who had made a decision about something and was implementing it. "Can I sit?" she said. He gestured at the chair across from him. She sat. She looked at the table for a moment and then at him. "The Alvarado partnership," she said. "They're still in. Ferreira called me on day 3. He said, and I'm telling you this exactly as he said it, that any company whose CEO faces down armed mercenaries and stays in the room is a company he wants to be in business with." "That's one way to build a commercial relationship," Ethan said. "Apparently." The corner of her mouth moved. "The FBI has a lead on the primary data brokerage. Marsh says they're looking at arrests within 30 days. That's faster than I expected. Raymond is motivated to be helpful." Ethan nodded. He looked at his sandwich. "How's Derek?" The question seemed to catch her slightly off guard, not unpleasantly, just unexpectedly. "Functioning," she said. "He took 4 days off and came back. First morning he was back, he reorganized the entire filing system for the legal department, which nobody asked him to do and which took him until 9 p.m. She paused. "I think it was his version of reasserting order." "Sounds about right." "Andrea is fine. Ferreira sent her flowers, which I thought was a very Ferreira thing to do." Ethan found himself thinking about the holiday party and the little girl who had been convinced the lobby plant was a jungle, and the way Andrea had set her jaw in the conference room that morning, with her hands in her lap, like someone keeping themselves very deliberately in one piece. "Good," he said. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She had the posture of someone who has said the preamble and is now at the actual thing. "I want to offer you a position," she said. He looked at her. "Head of Physical Security Operations," she said. "It's not a title we currently have in the company structure because the role didn't exist until about 11 days ago when I realized with some clarity that our security framework was built by people who had never actually been tested by anything serious." She held his gaze. "I'm not offering it because of what happened. I'm offering it because of what I watched you do. The specific way you thought through it, the decisions you made, the order you made them in. That's not training alone, that's judgment, and I have a significant deficit of it in this building's security infrastructure." Ethan was quiet. "It pays significantly more than your current role," she said. You'd have staffing authority, budget authority, and full access to every system in the building. You'd also have input on the protocols we implement going forward, which are going to be substantially overhauled. She paused. I'm not asking you to answer right now. He looked at the table. He looked at the remains of his lunch. He thought about the supply shuttle route and the HVAC panel on 12 and the morning bag check with Gerald and 3 years of building a life around the idea that the man he used to be could be set down somewhere and left there. I thought about the conference room and the ceiling access and the stairwell he'd pointed cross toward, and the moment he'd registered that Victoria Sterling was buying time at a biometric panel with more composure than most people bring to board meetings. He thought about Lily's sticky note on the unfinished page. I need to think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. She stood up, and he stood out of the reflex of someone raised in a particular way that has never fully left him, and they were both standing in the small break room with the bad coffee machine and the fluorescent light that had been buzzing on the same frequency for as long as Ethan could remember. One more thing, Victoria said. She said it with the slight shift in tone of someone moving from professional to something adjacent to it, but not quite the same. The position comes with standard benefits, relocation assistance if relevant, and I would require you to actually see the doctor about those ribs. I saw the doctor, he said. What did they say? Too cracked, not broken. Rest and anti-inflammatories. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who is deciding whether to say the thing she's thinking. Are you resting? She said. I'm sitting in a break room eating lunch, he said. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. She looked back, and in the afternoon light from the break room window, she looked like someone who had been through a significant thing and had come out on the other side of it, not unchanged but still standing, and he thought that was probably the most accurate description of both of them right now. Not particularly, he admitted. Work on that, she said. She left. He sat back down and looked at his sandwich and the question she'd left in the room with him, which was not a simple question and did not have a simple answer, and was going to require the kind of thinking that he did best late at night when Lily was asleep, and the apartment was quiet, and there was nothing between him and whatever he was actually thinking. He picked up his sandwich. The break room was quiet around him, and the building moved through its afternoon in the ordinary way that buildings do. And somewhere in the tower above him, 40-some people who had come to work 11 days ago, not expecting anything in particular, were doing the thing that people do after surviving something. The slow, imperfect, necessary work of deciding what it meant and who they were going to be now that it was over. Ethan Cole sat in the break room and finished his lunch and thought about a question and did not yet have the answer. Part 5. Louis. Viết 4.400 map từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện uyển ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liên mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình, viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cắm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo. Phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, hidden bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dùng giữa câu, hãy viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Show more. He gave himself a week to think about it. That was the deal he made with himself on the walk back from the break room to the supply bay, where his cart was waiting with a delivery manifest that needed completing and an HVAC panel on 6 that had started making noise again in the way that HVAC panels make noise when they want attention. He would do his job for one more week, think about Victoria's offer with whatever clarity he could assemble after the day's work was done, and not make a decision from the position of someone still inside the event. That was the plan. It lasted 4 days. On the fourth evening, Lily found him at the kitchen table with a notepad that had almost nothing written on it. 2 columns, pros and cons, the most honest of which was that the pros column had 3 items, and the cons column had 1 item that kept expanding into subpoints. She looked at the notepad and pulled out the chair across from him with the decisiveness of someone who has been watching something and has decided to stop watching. "What are you doing?" she said. "Thinking." "About the job thing?" He looked at her. "How do you know about a job thing?" "You've been at the kitchen table every night for 4 days," she said. "You only do that when something is a big decision. Last time you did it was when we were deciding whether to move here." He put the pen down. "I got offered a new position at work." She sat down with her elbows on the table in the way that she did when she was giving something her full attention. "What kind?" "Security. Managing the safety systems for the whole building. Making sure what happened last month doesn't happen again." Lily was quiet for a moment, in the evaluating way she had. "Is it more money?" "Yes." "Do you want to do it?" The question, asked with the directness that children bring to things that adults have learned to approach sideways, landed in exactly the place where he'd been circling for 4 days without landing. "I think so," he said. "I'm not sure I trust that." She looked at him. "Why not?" He thought about how to say this to an 8-year-old in a way that was honest without being the kind of honest that an 8-year-old shouldn't have to carry. He thought about the bridge. He thought about the 2 cracked ribs that still ached when he breathed too deeply. He thought about the specific fear he'd been living adjacent to for 3 years. Not the fear of violence, which he'd made his peace with, but the fear of becoming again the man who found violence useful, and the further fear that he might not mind. "Because I spent a long time trying to stop being someone who does this kind of thing," he said carefully. "And I'm not completely sure why I want to start again. Whether it's because it's the right thing, or because it's the thing I'm good at, and I miss being good at something in that way." Lily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Can't it be both?" she said. He looked at her. "Mrs. Kowalski says I'm good at math, and I also like math," she said. "She says those things usually go together, and that's not a bad thing. That's just how it works." He sat with this for a moment. "Mrs. Kowalski is pretty smart," he said. "She's excellent," Lily said, with the authority of someone who has made a thorough assessment. "So are you taking it?" He looked at the notepad, the pros column, the cons column, and its expanding subpoints, which mostly reduced to versions of the same fear he'd just described, which his daughter had just addressed with the clarity that people acquire before they learn to complicate things unnecessarily. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." Lily nodded as if this had been obvious for some time. "Can I have a snack?" "There's fruit on the counter." "I was thinking more in the direction of crackers." "There's fruit on the counter, Lily." She pushed back from the table with the expression of someone who has achieved her actual objective and is content to accept the nominal defeat on the secondary front. He called Victoria the next morning. The transition took 3 weeks. It was not a graceful 3 weeks. Ethan had never managed a corporate security department because he had never managed anything in a corporate building, and the gap between knowing how to move through dangerous spaces and knowing how to construct the institutional systems that prevent those spaces from becoming dangerous was significant and filled with a learning curve that he navigated by doing what he always did when he didn't know something. He asked questions, he listened to the answers, and he didn't perform expertise he didn't have. The existing security staff responded to this with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The 2 who had been most vocal about their professional opinions in the initial security framework meetings became his most useful collaborators. Because people who tell you what they actually think are more valuable than people who tell you what they think you want to hear, even when what they think is that your proposed changes are going to create logistical headaches. He rebuilt the camera coverage first, eliminating the blind spots that Cross's team had exploited, adding redundant systems at every entry point, including the stairwells, and establishing a monitoring protocol that required 2-person confirmation for any system irregularity rather than the single operator response that had been standard. He upgraded the access credentials for all contractor work, requiring 48-hour advance authorization and identity verification against a central database rather than the rotating roster system that had made it possible for 2 men in contractor uniforms to spend the morning of the attack repositioning cameras without triggering an alarm. He also, on the second week, walked every floor of the building with a legal pad and wrote down everything he saw that a person with operational intent might use. Service corridors, freight access, utility panels, the southwest egress stairwell that had never been properly documented, which he documented with the specific attention of someone who understood that the same feature could be either a vulnerability or an asset, depending entirely on who knew about it and when. Gerald at the front desk watched him come and go with the notepad and said, "On the third day, you're the one, aren't you?" Ethan stopped at the desk. "The one what?" he said. Gerald looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has been watching something for 11 years and whose attention people routinely underestimate. The one who dealt with it, on 12. Ethan held his gaze without confirming or denying, which was itself a kind of answer. Gerald nodded slowly. "Figured," he said. "Bag check not required anymore, I assume?" "Bag check is still required," Ethan said. "For everyone." Gerald looked at him. "Including me," Ethan said. Gerald's expression shifted towards something that was not quite a smile but was related to one. He held out his hand. Ethan shook it. They had known each other for 3 years in the way that people in large buildings know each other, which is to say, not at all. And they were now something incrementally different from that, which was small and real. Damian Cross was arrested on a Tuesday morning, 41 days after the Sterling Tower incident, by a joint federal and international law enforcement operation at a private airfield outside the city. The arrest was coordinated simultaneously with operations targeting 3 of the 4 other members of his team who had exited through the southwest stairwell. The 4th, the man Ethan had identified as Briggs, remained at large as of the date the FBI notified Ethan of the arrest, and the agent who called said they expected that to resolve within weeks. Ethan thanked her and put the phone down and sat at his new desk. An actual desk in an actual office, on the security level of the building, which was a thing he was still getting used to in the particular way that you get used to something by continuing to sit in it until the strangeness wears off. And he thought about Cross. He thought about the airfield and what it meant to be a man like Cross, skilled and disciplined, and fully capable and pointed in the entirely wrong direction for long enough that it became simply the direction. He thought about the bridge comment Cross had made at the conference room door, the parting statement about the right call and the wrong outcome, and he thought about whether he believed it. He wasn't sure he believed it. He wasn't sure he didn't. What he believed was that the bridge was 4 years ago, and his ribs were healing, and Lily had strong opinions about crackers, and that the distance between those 2 facts was the actual shape of his life, and the actual shape of your life was the only true measure of whether the calls you'd made had been the right ones. He picked up the legal pad with the floor-by-floor security notes and went back to work. Raymond Solis received his sentence on a Thursday, 14 weeks after the incident. Ethan was not in the courtroom. He had been asked whether he wanted to provide a victim impact statement and had said no, not because he had nothing to say, but because what he had to say was not the kind of thing that belonged in a courtroom, addressed to a man who already knew it. What he had to say was simpler than that and less official. That the thing Raymond had done was not primarily a betrayal of Victoria Sterling's company, or her technology, or her commercial interests, as significant as those were. It was a betrayal of the ordinary trust that makes a building of 47 people possible, the baseline agreement between people who work in close proximity that the person in the next office is not actively arranging for your death. That was the thing that couldn't be sentenced and couldn't be repaired by cooperation, and the man sitting in the courtroom in whatever expression of remorse he was wearing already knew it. Marsh called him afterward with the sentence details. 7 years, federal facility, the cooperation discount already applied. Ethan thanked him, and they talked for a few minutes about how the broader investigation was progressing, the data brokerage firm whose principals were looking at their own charges, the venture capital entity that was unwinding under regulatory scrutiny, the whole ecosystem of it, dismantling itself in the way that illegal enterprises dismantle when enough people start cooperating. "How's the new role?" Marsh asked at the end. "Complicated," Ethan said. "Better than I expected." "You planning to stay?" Ethan thought about the legal pad, the camera coverage maps, the conversation with Gerald, the meeting he had tomorrow with the full security staff where he was going to present the revised protocols, and expected at least 2 of them to argue with him, which he was looking forward to in the way that you look forward to things that keep you sharp. "Yeah," he said. I think so. Victoria found him on the roof. This was not something he'd planned to become a habit, going to the roof. But the building had a maintenance access level above 12 that included a small exterior platform used for HVAC and communications equipment, and Ethan had found during the third week that it was useful to go up there at the end of particularly dense days and look at the city for 15 minutes before getting in his truck. It was not a sentimental ritual, it was a pressure valve, the same way running had been a pressure valve during his service years, and the supply shuttle route had been a pressure valve in his earlier time at Sterling. You needed something that moved at a pace different from the pace of the work. Victoria appeared through the access door on a Thursday evening in the 6th week of his new role, wearing the coat she usually wore when she had back-to-back external meetings and hadn't had time to go home and change, which meant today had been a long one. She looked at the city and then at him. "Gerald told me you come up here," she said. "I'll have a conversation with Gerald about discretion," Ethan said. "Don't," I specifically asked. She came to stand at the railing a few feet from him. The city was doing the thing it does in the early evening in autumn, the lights coming up in the office buildings across the way, while the sky behind them was still holding the last of the day's color. "The Alvarado partnership formally executed today," she said. "Full terms, new security addendum, and a clause that I added personally that gives our teams full audit rights over any data handling done on our behalf." "Ferreira agreed to that?" "Ferreira proposed it," she said. "He said the incident demonstrated that we took security seriously, and he wanted the partnership to reflect that." Ethan looked at the city. "You're 38%, he said. The data they got out. The FBI's technical team believes it's been effectively isolated. The receiving system was seized in the brokerage operation, and the transferred files were recovered before they could be distributed. We won't know for certain for months, but the current assessment is that it hasn't reached anyone who can use it against us." "That's good. It's better than I had any right to expect 6 weeks ago," she said. "So yes, that's good." They stood at the railing for a moment in the not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable silence that had become the characteristic texture of the time they spent in each other's presence. Two people who had been through something together that they hadn't finished processing and probably wouldn't finish processing for a while, which was fine because processing things had a pace and you couldn't hurry it. "I owe you something," Victoria said. "You don't." "Not a debt, just something I've been carrying that I should say." She looked at the city, not at him. "In that room. When you came in through the ceiling and cross and you were standing there and he said, 'I know who you are.' I didn't know what he meant. I didn't know anything about you except that you drove the supply shuttle and you were very calm in a situation where calm didn't seem like the rational response." She paused. "What I've thought about since is not what you did. It's that you had every possible reason to make a different choice. You could have gotten yourself out through that stairwell. You could have gone to a lower floor and waited. Whatever happened on 12 was not your responsibility, and you knew it was dangerous, and you went back anyway. And what I want to say is that I see that, not as a professional matter, just, I see it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "The people in that room didn't choose to be there," he said. "I mean, they did. They came to work. But they didn't choose what happened. I don't know if capability is the right word. Training. I had training that none of them had. Walking away from that felt like a worse thing than going back." "Even with Lily?" The question landed carefully, the way she delivered things when she'd thought about whether to say them. "Especially with Lily," he said. "Because she's watching what I do. Not what I say about what's right. What I actually do when it's real." Victoria turned to look at him. He could feel it without looking back. "How is she?" Victoria said. "She wants to meet you," Ethan said. "She has since I told her you were the one who told me it was my building and let me say it first." He glanced at her. "She said that was good leadership. She's been reading about leadership. I don't know where she got the books." Victoria looked at him with the expression he'd first registered at the biometric panel and had since learned to read as the external sign of Victoria Sterling finding something genuinely unexpected. "She sounds extraordinary." "She's 8 and she has opinions about crackers," Ethan said. "But yes, essentially." Something settled in Victoria's expression. Something that had been in tension releasing slightly, the way a room feels different after a window is opened. "The roof is off the official security map," she said. "Should it be on it?" "It's on mine," he said. "That's enough." She nodded. She puts. She looked at the city one more time and then straightened from the railing. Go home, Ethan, she said. Lily's waiting. She's at her grandmother's tonight. Then go home and rest your ribs. They're healed. They healed 4 days ago, and you've been here until 7 every night since, she said. He looked at her. She looked back with the directness that was simply how her face worked, and that he'd stopped finding startling somewhere around the 3rd week. Good night, Victoria, he said. Good night, she said, and went back through the access door, and he stood at the railing for another 10 minutes in the quiet of a city doing its evening, which was neither dramatic nor small, just a city being what it was. He had gone to the bridge once, in the years since. Not the bridge, a different bridge, in a different city. In the 2nd year after his discharge, when Lily was 6 and staying with his sister for a long weekend, and he'd driven 4 hours to stand somewhere near water and think in the particular way he needed to think, which required open space and the movement of things larger than himself. He'd stood on that bridge for an hour and thought about Yusuf and Garrett and the call he'd made and all the alternative calls he'd failed to make, and then he'd driven back. He hadn't arrived at anything, exactly. That was the thing about the bridge. It wasn't a question with an answer. It was a fact with weight. And the question wasn't how to resolve it, but how to carry it without letting the weight collapse everything else. He'd carried it wrong for a while. He'd carried it better after Lily. He'd carried it differently since the morning on 12, when something Cross had said at the conference room door had lodged in a place he was still examining. Not because it absolved anything, but because it named something true, which was that the moral weight of a decision and the outcome of a decision were not always the same calculation, and that confusing them was its own kind of error. He was not fixed. He knew this about himself with a clarity that had come from stopping pretending otherwise. He had cracked ribs that had healed, and a split lip that had healed, and a grief that was 3 years old and still present, and a job that asked him every day to be someone he'd tried to stop being, and he was figuring out, slowly and imperfectly, how to be that person in a way that didn't cost him the other things he was. A father. A man with a noted desk and a legal pad. A man who went to the roof to look at the city and who shook hands with Gerald in a lobby every morning and who had recently had a conversation with his daughter about crackers that had settled a 4-day decision in 30 seconds. These things coexisted. That was the finding, such as it was. Not that the hard parts went away, but that the other parts were real enough to hold their own weight alongside them. On a Saturday in the 7th week, Ethan took Lily to the Sterling Tower. It was not a work day. The building was staffed with weekend security, but the offices were quiet, and he had access to all of it now, which was still a thing he was getting used to. He took her up in the elevator, and she stood in it with her backpack and her graphic novel under her arm and looked at the floor numbers climbing. "Which floor?" she said. 12, he said. She thought about this. "Is that where it happened?" "Some of it." "Okay," she said. "No drama in it, just information received and filed." The executive floor was quiet in the way that office floors are quiet on weekends. The particular quality of spaces built for human activity that are temporarily without it. He walked her through the main corridor toward the conference room, and she walked beside him, looking at things with the attentive curiosity that she brought to everything. They stopped outside the conference room. The glass partition was clean. The table inside was exactly as it always was. The oval shape, and the 20 chairs and the window wall that let in the afternoon light. Lily looked at it. "It just looks like a room," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I thought it would look more like something happened." "Places usually don't," he said. "They just look like places." She thought about this. Then she looked at him. "Were you scared?" He had been asked this by the federal agents, by Marsh, by his sister on the phone the evening of the incident, and he had given variations of the same answer each time, which was that he had been focused rather than scared, that the training moved you past the scared into a different register. Which was true. It was also not the complete truth, and he looked at his daughter and gave her the more complete version. "At the beginning," he said, "when I first realized what was happening, before I started moving, there were a few seconds where, yeah, I was scared. Of getting hurt? Of not being enough," he said. "Of making the wrong call and people getting hurt because of it." Lily looked at the conference room for another moment. "But you weren't," she said. "Not enough." "You were." He looked at her. 8 years old, graphic novel under her arm, the evaluating expression that was going to be formidable when she was 40. Yeah, he said. This time. This time is what happened, she said, with the particular logic of someone who deals in facts and finds most philosophical complications to be optional complications. He put his hand on the top of her head briefly, which she tolerated because she understood it was his version of something he couldn't always say. Victoria was waiting for them near the elevator bank. She had come in on her own time, which he hadn't asked her to, and which she had apparently decided to do anyway. And she was standing with the easy posture of someone in her own space on a day without a schedule. She was wearing something more casual than he'd ever seen her in at the building, still put together, because he suspected that was simply constitutional. And she looked, in the specific light of a Saturday afternoon, like a person rather than a CEO, which he understood were not mutually exclusive, but which had been easy to conflate. Lily looked at her, then she looked at Ethan, then back at Victoria. "You're her," Lily said. "I'm Victoria," Victoria said, and crouched slightly to meet her eye level, which was not a gesture people always made, and which Lily registered with the attention she gave to things that signaled whether a person was worth taking seriously. "My dad said you picked up a piece of equipment and put it on the table in front of the guy with the scar," Lily said. Victoria glanced at Ethan. He raised an eyebrow slightly in the way that communicated he had not given her that level of detail. "I told her the broad strokes," he said. "Broad strokes," Lily repeated with mild skepticism. "That's approximately what happened," Victoria said. "It seemed like a useful thing to do at the time." "Dad says the things that seem useful are usually right," Lily said. "But he also said you have to check your math because useful and right aren't always the same thing." Victoria looked at her for a moment. "That is an extremely accurate thing to say." "He's pretty smart," Lily said, with the matter-of-factness of someone reporting a fact rather than offering praise. "When he's not being difficult about crackers." Ethan looked at the ceiling. "I don't know what that means," Victoria said. "It means he's a fruit person when I want crackers," Lily said. "It's a whole thing." Victoria stood back up and looked at Ethan with the expression he had learned meant she was genuinely entertained but was not going to give him the satisfaction of showing all of it. "Fruit is fine," she said to Lily, "but crackers have their place." Lily looked at Ethan. The look said, "See." "Noted," Ethan said. They took the elevator down together, Lily between them asking Victoria questions about the building with the focused directness of someone conducting an actual interview, and Victoria answering them with the same directness. And Ethan stood in the elevator listening to his daughter and this woman talk about structural load-bearing and whether the windows could open and how many people worked on each floor, and he felt something that he didn't immediately have a word for. It wasn't happiness exactly, though it was near that. It was more like the sensation of realizing that something you thought had a fixed shape had more room in it than you'd accounted for. That the life you'd built in the aftermath of the thing that broke you was not just a smaller version of the life before, but something with its own actual dimensions, which you couldn't fully see until you stopped keeping the inventory of what was missing and started looking at what was there. He had a daughter who would probably be a formidable person, if she wasn't already. He had a job that used the parts of him he'd spent 3 years trying to put away, and asked him to use them for something that mattered. He had cracked ribs that had healed, and a bridge he visited occasionally in his memory and left without resolution and carried forward without pretending it resolved, which was the honest version of how grief actually moves. He had this elevator, and these two people, on a Saturday afternoon in a building he had walked through for 3 years without being seen and now knew better than anyone. The doors opened on the lobby. Gerald was at the front desk. He'd come in on his day off for reasons he hadn't explained, which Ethan suspected had something to do with the weekend security staff not having his particular 11-year understanding of the building's rhythms. Gerald looked at the three of them coming out of the elevator and nodded once. Ethan nodded back. They walked through the lobby, Lily still talking, her voice clear and unapologetic in the weekend quiet, and the glass doors opened onto the street and the afternoon light and the ordinary Saturday business of a city that had no particular awareness of what had happened in the tower behind them, which was exactly right, because cities weren't required to keep the inventory of things that happened inside buildings, and neither, he was slowly learning, was he. He had done the thing. He had been enough this time. He had picked up the weight when it arrived and set it back down when it was done, and he had walked out of the building and driven to his daughter and eaten pho on Clement Street and come back to work the next morning. That was the whole story. Not a clean one. not a triumphant one, except in the way that ordinary days are their own small triumph. When you've had enough years where ordinary days weren't something you could count on. A man who had been broken by one bridge and rebuilt himself around the people who needed him to stand, and who was still, imperfectly and continuously, doing exactly that. Lily reached over and took his hand when they got to the sidewalk, the automatic way she did it. Not because she needed to, but because she always had, and some habits are better than others. He held it. Victoria walked alongside them on his other side, and they stood for a moment on the sidewalk deciding which direction, and the city moved around them in the ordinary, beautiful, unceremonious way that cities do, indifferent and full of life, neither of them knowing yet what the next thing would look like, both of them standing in it anyway. That was enough. That was, Ethan Cole had come to understand, the only thing that ever actually was.